Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of UCB on Mission. If you are a Christian, then you are following Jesus on his mission to love God and love neighbor. Now, my part in that mission looks different than your part in that mission. So, UCB on Mission is a space where we can discuss together, learn together about our work as a church family on the mission of God. As the Apostle Paul says, so whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. Now, speaking of eating and drinking, I'd like to acknowledge our dear sponsors and friends over at Sola, some of the finest New Orleans cuisine that you'll have this side of, in South America. We'll say it like that. It's delicious. Yesterday, I had the Cajun fried chicken po' boy for lunch, and it made my day. Maybe it'll make your day too. Check out the details underneath this video and check out our friends over at Sola. All right, I want to introduce my guest this afternoon. John Mark, let me pull you up on the screen. We've got John Mark Filcik here, who is a teacher at Colegio Nueva Granada. Hey, John Mark, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, Pastor Andrew, I'm excited to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, this is exciting. All right, so some folks may know you. I'd love if you'd introduce yourself and just tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, how long you've been in Bogota, a little about your family.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Yeah, my name is John Mark. So I moved to Bogota almost exactly 2 years ago with my wife, Ella. She was 5 months pregnant at the time we moved here, and then she has since obviously had our son, Theodore. And yeah, I grew up in Michigan in the United States, went to university in Ohio. After going to college, Ella and I got married and we moved out to Delaware. So like just outside Philadelphia, where I taught high school science for a few years before moving to Columbia, which is where we're at right now.
Awesome. And so John Mark and Ella, you may know them from church because they've been members since they've been here. But John Mark leads our home group ministry, and Ella heads up our women's ministry. And in his free time, he teaches, as he said, at CNG. Tell us a little bit about what you teach, what subjects and grades you're teaching there.
Yeah, so I teach in the middle school at CNG. I teach 6th and 7th grade, and I'm also the science department head for the middle school. But yeah, this year, 6th and 7th grade science.
And this year, in all likelihood, for at least a couple of months without stepping foot on campus, right?
Exactly. Right now, what we've been told is that we'll be online through at least September 4th, but as we all know, it'll probably be extended. So we'll probably be online for a while yet.
Yeah, we are on a wild ride together. Just before I forget about it, I've been thinking a lot about you parents out there who are jumping in, teachers as well, into this semester, not really knowing where things are going to go and how you're going to balance work and family and helping to oversee the education of your kids. And we as a church are praying for you. That is no easy task. John Mark, you glossed over it pretty quickly. You talked about going from Delaware here, but tell us a little bit more about the journey that led you to explore international teaching and end up, in Bogota of all places.
Yeah. So since my wife and I, since we were dating in college, right, we've always had a dream to live overseas, live in a different culture, learn another language, things like that. Both of us grew up in relatively small towns in the Midwest. And at least for me, it really wasn't until college that I ever left the country. So I think after we got married, we moved to Delaware, lived there for a few years, really loved our ministry there and the community we formed there. But while we were there, I learned about international schools. I had never heard of them or didn't know that was a thing until then. And so we, worked with an organization that basically places teachers with international schools. Through that organization, we applied to probably 40 or 50 schools all over the place. We really wanted to come to Latin America because we really wanted to focus on learning Spanish. However, we didn't know what job offers we'd get, so we applied all over the place. Excuse me. By the end of it all, we ended up getting quite a few job offers in different places, but what really separated Bogota for us was the chance to like live in the city. Like a lot of the other schools were like boarding schools, so you're kind of like in this little bubble by yourself. But we really appreciated the idea of, having Colombian neighbors and living with, having Colombian friends and stuff like that. And we also really wanted to learn Spanish. And, everyone said when we first started looking at Colombia that Colombia was one of the best places to learn Spanish because of the accent. And since being here, I totally can affirm that, right? Like it's so, Colombians have such a clear way of speaking Spanish that for us English speakers, it's very, very helpful. So we're still working on learning Spanish little by little. And I think I'm going to quickly give a shout out to my Spanish tutor, Martha, who I think is watching. So shout out to Martha. And but that's what kind of brought us to CNG and we've into Colombia, and we've really, really loved it.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think Colombia, no offense to you other Latinos who are watching or will watch, but Colombia really ruins you for picking up Spanish in other places. Even within Colombia, Bogotano Spanish especially is just so clear and beautiful. I am totally with you there. All right, I want to say hey to folks that are in the live chat. If you log on and you're in the live chat, say hello to us. We've got Sarah and Jeremy. Hey guys, hope you're doing well. Hope you're feeling well. Sarah, I've been praying for you. We've got Victoria. Hey Victoria. And the Griffiths, a fellow teacher, though in the British system. So you've got a little rivalry here already in the chat. Hey Robert. All right, this is the point in time before we go much further. You are a science teacher. And at least when I spoke to my little ones about that, they wondered what that was. So it is time for me to introduce my favorite segment, Questions from a Kid.
It's time for Questions from a Kid.
All right, and because my kids are out exercising right now for the last little window they have, until we go back into lockdown tomorrow, I had to record my kid asking a question. So we have Evie Jude morning asking
What is a science teacher?
Awesome. Good question, Evie. So a science teacher is someone who teaches students, in my case, kids, how to learn more about the world around them, how to learn about the natural world, like how to investigate it, how to ask questions about it, how to run experiments on it, right, to learn more about it.
Very cool. And I hear Ella in the background singing opera. That's kudos. She's
exactly, yeah.
very gifted. Andrea Kinzinger says, "Hi, John. So proud of you." So she's here in the.
That's my mother-in-law. So thank you.
I thought that was your mother-in-law.
Yeah.
Very good. All right, Evie, second question coming at you.
Why do you decide to become a science teacher?
All right, so Evie wants to know why. What led you?
Yeah, so I became a teacher because I wanted to work with kids, right, and like impact them and their learning and their lives in some way. Specifically science. I find science to be a really fun subject to teach, partially because most kids, when they enter a science class, are already excited about it. And I know that's like a challenge that like a math teacher probably has, right? When a lot of students just have more negative feelings towards math, and that's a challenge for a math teacher to turn that negative perception around. But for me, I think it's really cool that kids enter a science class. They're normally really excited. Kids like hands-on things, right? And that's what science normally can provide them. So it's just a fun class to teach.
Why do you think it is kids come to science class already interested?
Yeah, there's a lot of different reasons. I think a lot of times a kid's main experience with science is explosions and chemical reactions and just really fun eye candy type of things. So I think they come to class with that in mind, and obviously part of what we do is make them realize it's a lot more than just watching cool things explode, right? Or watching volcanoes erupt, right? There's a lot more to it than that. But I think generally in our culture, the way science is portrayed, even in movies and shows and stuff, it just looks really fun and exciting. So I think some kids maybe we don't really meet their expectations 100% as far as that goes, but at least they enter the class excited.
Yeah. Well, that leads very well into Evie's last question.
How do you make potions?
How do you make potions? So a potion, I think if you mean like a potion being like a mixture of chemicals, right? I guess you just mix different chemicals in such a way that they react. Actually have for you right here a potion I'm going to show you, Evie. So I hope Evie watches the recording of this.
Okay. Awesome.
Here we have, I don't know if you can see this in a second. Up right here, I'm going to add this chemical and we'll see what happens.
Super cool.
This right here is a potion. Made. I'll just call it a potion for now. So this is for you, Abby. If you want to take a sip or something, come on over to our place and I'll give you some.
That's super cool. That is really, really cool. Yeah. So we've got Kevin Filcik, I assume a relative, saying that he can't stop smiling as he watches you. So you've got a fan club here watching live, and I'm sure others will jump in later. Thank you, Evie. Evie is going to like that whenever she's back from her bike ride,
Awesome.
Checking out your science experiment. Okay, so this is UCB on mission. I'd love if you could connect the dots for our viewers about how you fancy yourself as a science teacher on the mission of God. So how is this work a part of the mission of God?
Yeah, totally. So when I think about my mission as a science teacher, or my mission in life as it relates to my work, I always think back to Genesis when God told Adam and Eve to subdue the earth, and to me, like what subdue means, right, is take what is like chaos and turn it into order, right? Like the Garden of Eden, right, is an untamed, wild jungle in a lot of ways, right? And humans have come on earth to subdue it, to form civilization, to form culture. So I'm sorry about the opera singer off my balcony. But to subdue it and form civilization and form culture and to really bring order out of chaos. And I think as a teacher, like for me, what it means to bring order out of chaos is to obviously to manage a classroom full of middle schoolers. Like that's a lot of chaos, and to make that ordered and make it like productive and meaningful is a huge part of my mission. Also, as far as like a student's mind, right? What they know, what they understand. If you don't know how to think about something, or if you just before you've learned something, right? It's chaos in there. Like, and my job as a teacher is to help order what they're learning, order their understanding, in order to subdue the earth in a small way. So that's how when I view my work, that's how I view like how what I'm doing is on mission for God, even beyond, like the relationships, because of course that's a huge part of our mission too, like building relationships with students and teachers and coworkers and whatnot. But I think like the actual act of like what I do as teaching also is a form of subduing the earth.
Yeah, and you've been given a very high privilege too. You think about, I love the image of making order out of chaos. When you think about all the scattershot observations of your average 6th, 7th, 8th grader that comes into your classroom, and you say, "Hey, let me put this in order for you, and let me explain that there's an overarching rhythm to all of this." And I know. I do want to talk a little bit about the intersection of faith and science. Probably the best way to get into that is to get your definition of science, and you can give us the adult definition. You don't have to give us the 6-year-old definition.
Yeah, so I would say science is a way of knowing about the world, right? Science reveals to us is one way of knowing about the world, right? It's not the only way, which I think is a super important distinction. And it involves like a number of different steps, right? So when we think of science, we think of, at least for the average student coming into my class, they think of like experiments, right? That's one way to gather data to learn about the world, right? Like to do an experiment. If it's okay, I kind of want to take the opportunity to nerd out on like science education. So like, I love talking about this stuff. So basically when it comes to science, like in general, if you think about like in the old days, right? Or not old days, like this could be like when I was a kid. Science education was predominantly more about like learning facts, right? Like what do the organelles in a cell do? What are the elements in the periodic table? What is the atomic number for nitrogen? Whatever, right? Like facts. But since in the last like 10-ish years, there's been a huge move away from that towards this idea of teaching kids like practices or skills that they can use to access scientific knowledge, right? So like the content is stuff is super important, right? But there's also these like skills, and these skills are asking questions, right? So it's super important. Like before you start learning about anything in science, you first have to ask a good scientific question. And like what you said, Andrew, about like bringing order out of chaos, like when a sixth grader comes into my class and the first time we practice asking questions about something, you know, it is like chaos, right? They're asking about like everything under the sun that's somewhat related to whatever we're supposed to be talking about. But I think bringing and helping kids like hone in on like solid scientific questions that are about the phenomenon, that are about things that can help drive our learning, right, is super important. So asking questions, developing models, planning investigations is the third one. So like planning experiments, analyzing data. These are off the top of my head. Obtaining and evaluating information. So like research is a big part of science, right? As is mathematical thinking. So like I always say like math is like the language by which we view science, right? It's like where you have to understand the mathematical component of science in order to understand a lot of it. And constructing explanations. So explaining why something happens is huge, as well as engaging in argument from evidence, right? So like a lot of times in science, there are disagreements, and you need, if you need to engage in argument with that using evidence, and that using evidence is the key point, right? Those are all like different ways we access scientific knowledge, and that's like what science is. Like I ideally, you know, would prefer for kids to leave my class understanding those skills more so than understanding like what the mitochondria does in a cell, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. All right, so because my kids are this and they're going to be super impressed with your potion, how would you explain to them how you just made a glob in the bottom of your glass by pouring liquid into it, a bubbly orange substance that looked very inviting to a 6-year-old?
Totally. So basically, that's a great question. Okay. Basically, there was some powder in the bottom of this cup, right? And the powder is made of little atoms, right? And there are like 120, something like that, 120-ish different types of atoms in the world, right? The powder in there is called baking soda, right? So it's sodium bicarbonate. So it's made of a sodium atom. Wait, NaC2O3. I want to say a sodium atom, 2 carbons, and 3 oxygen atoms, right? Each molecule has those 3 atoms in it. And basically, when I added the liquid, which was vinegar, the atoms in the vinegar and the atoms in the baking soda combined and rearranged to form something new, right? So the baking soda and the vinegar, one of the things they formed was carbon dioxide. So the reason you had all those bubbles is because the atoms reorganized and formed carbon dioxide. And that's what bubbles are. Bubbles are just like gas that's being released, right? And it looks really cool, but it's just gas that's going away. Yeah. I feel like maybe I should practice that explanation again for.
That's fantastic. That's great. And so they're going to ask me, why did it turn orange, Dad?
Okay, so that was kind of like, so I added, there was orange food coloring in the bottom.
Okay.
It was just food coloring that made it orange. Otherwise, it would have just been bubbly and stuff.
And food coloring is which part of the periodic table of elements?
I don't know. Good question.
I have to admit, I have a love relationship with science, just because I wish that I had the skills. I went to university thinking that I wanted to be a pharmacist, and then I got into my chemistry class, and I loved biology, and chemistry was just too. It was too much memorization and too much. I couldn't do it, and I knew that I needed to be around people more than I needed to be around the periodic table of elements. And so I flunked out and went to business school instead. I didn't flunk out, but I opted out after a semester of intensive science courses. And but I'm really intrigued. I had this wonderful science teacher my freshman year of university, and he defined science the way you did. This is one of the ways we can know things. And so I'm interested in what is underneath that definition, because I don't suspect, I know because I read this a lot. Many people say this is the way we know things because it's observable and measurable, and you can't know something unless you can observe it and measure it. So could you tease out a little bit what's underneath your definition of one of the ways we know things?
Yeah, so I think what you said exactly, right? Like science is a way to know things using empirical data, right? Like using observations, measurements in order to discover things about the world, right? But like the reason I think that's a really important distinction to make is because I would say like science tells us how things work. Like it's like a way for us to figure out how things work, to know how things work. But like the huge thing you don't get from science is why things work that way. So you might understand, for example, like how some disease attacks the human body. Like we use science, observation, experiment, controlled trials, whatever, in order to understand how this disease attacks the body. But we don't understand like the why. Why should we care for a person who has this disease, who lives on the other side of the world, right? Like science can't answer those questions. And that's where, for us as Christians, that's where we go. That's where we get those answers from our faith, right, and from the Bible. So I think that science is like measurable, observable data.
And how do you? So you live as a Christian and as a science teacher. I said you live at the intersection of education, faith, and science, right? How do you value your scientific observations with your faith observations, with your faith knowledge? Is one subservient to the other? Are they equal? Are they constantly at tension where you're having to convince yourself that no, this can't be true because this is true?
Yeah, it's really hard, I think, because there is oftentimes, I think, with science and our faith, there can be a perceived tension. But I feel like, this is my opinion, so I don't want to say this is necessarily truth, but like I believe that tension is sometimes over like exaggerated or overemphasized, perhaps, right? Like, so I mean, obviously we as humans have benefited immensely from scientific breakthroughs, specifically with like medicine and sanitation and things like that. So we need to appreciate that, while also realizing that science isn't a religion on itself. Like I think what you said is very true, that like in this culture, especially in the States right now, where like religion is on the decline, right? Like so many people are turning to science as a religion, as like the all-knowing way to solve everything in the world. Just like people are also turning to politics as a religion, right? Like different ways to find fulfillment in this world. And so I hope I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but like, so I think science is like, a really important way we find out information about the world. But it shouldn't be put on a pedestal as the only way. And, I think, one, like we talked about when I said that, I think that like tension is sometimes overemphasized. So at my previous job, I taught 9th and 10th grade science in the States. And, there was a standard I had to teach about the Big Bang Theory. So students, I think the standard was something like students needed to be able to articulate the evidence scientists use to back up the Big Bang Theory. In my mind, when I was teaching that at the time, I thought like, oh man, like the Big Bang Theory is the opposite of what we're told in the Bible, right? It's like the Bible, we're told God created the world. The Big Bang Theory is saying we're all here by a bizarre cataclysmic chance, right? And so it was very difficult for me to teach students like that evidence, so they're familiar with the evidence. Obviously, it was an opportunity for me to share my faith as well in that moment. But I think since then, I've realized like, or I've learned that when the Big Bang Theory, as an example, like when it first became popularized, it was actually a huge. It was hugely, I don't know if supported is the right word. It's not the right word, but Christian scientists were very kind of affirmed by that theory, because before that the question was, has the universe always been, or did the universe come in a moment, right? Like did it once not exist, right? And the Big Bang Theory is much of science is like agreed upon way in which the universe came into being, and like it's so there's still scientists who believe in steady state, right? Like the universe has always been, but like the Big Bang Theory actually, in some ways, if you view it in a certain way, actually affirms what we believe as Christians. Like at one point the universe didn't exist, and in the beginning, like there was a beginning, right? Like, and that's the first 3 words of the Bible, right? In the beginning, like, and I think it's really tricky with that tension you're talking about. This is my opinion as well. Like when we view Genesis, how we view the Genesis account for the origins of the universe, like is it telling us how, or is it telling us why? Like is it telling us how like scientifically things came into being, or is it telling us like why we're here, right? Like we were created by an omnipotent God and we've been placed here on earth for a purpose. And that purpose is the purpose has become, and we messed that up, right? And like, but so I don't know. So I think like there are ways to view science in less like, in ways that are less like conflicting with your faith. Obviously, I don't want to downplay the fact that there are like really difficult debates and discussions that arise out of certain topics in science. But there are also so many topics in science that like also affirm so much about our God and what we know about Him, and like He's a God of order and a God who's very creative and a God who, yeah, like I hope that kind of answers your question.
No.
I kind of forget what the question was at this point. But.
No, that's fantastic. I love the distinction that you make between science can tell us how, but it can't give us the full answer to why. And in my own kind of, I've always been interested in science, and especially cosmology, how things came to be, right? So, in my own early 20s faith crisis, where I'm asking these questions and saying, is Christianity compatible with other things that I see in the world? Like, is it wrong that I can observe stuff and measure stuff? Is it wrong that we can like measure that the universe is still doing this number, right? And that if we rewind that it seems like you could rewind it back to a starting point that could be explained scientifically. Now we can't go back to the starting point and say what started, what put the kaboom in the bang. But is it wrong for me to do this? And by the time I got to seminary, I had some of these questions thanks to Francis Schaeffer, who was this guy that just loved to integrate everything you see, art, science, philosophy, politics. He wanted to bring it all together and to talk about big T truth. Like we can observe all these little T truths, and they're pointing us to a big T truth, whose author is the God of the Bible, the God of the universe. And so he had helped me along the way. And then I get to seminary, and one of the leading scholar, really one of the leading Old Testament scholars right now, is a guy who went to MIT and got a couple degrees at MIT, like a theologian going to MIT. Yeah, because he wanted to understand the science of language and how language is constructed. And it turns out when you look at the building blocks of language, it looks a lot like human DNA. And it's really cool. It's really bizarre. It's over my head, but so he's this guy, and he's explaining, all right, here's what the Bible is used for, and here's what it's not used for. And I want you to imagine a group of people who have been pulled out of Egypt, rescued by this God who they haven't really heard from in a few hundred years, and brought through all this crazy stuff, through the plagues, running from Pharaoh and from the Egyptians and the Red Sea thing, and now their enemies are gone, and they're wandering around, and they're on the plains of Moab, and they're looking into, kind of peeking over into the Promised Land. And Moses, kind of taps the music stand and says, "Okay, everybody, I want to connect the dots for you. In the beginning, God." And he begins to explain what we would call the book of Genesis. He tells them a story, and all these people I can picture on the edge of their, wilderness seats listening. And they hear Genesis chapter 1, and they hear Genesis chapter 2. And the question they're not asking is, all right, now, how is this compatible with the Big Bang thing that my biology teacher taught me, or my, that I read in this cosmology article? They're not asking a question about how. They're asking a question about why, right? Who is this God? Really, their why is a who. Who is this God? What does he require of me? And actually, Genesis 1 and 2 does a really good job answering that question. And it was not intended to ask a question that 21st century people, 4-ish thousand years later, not quite 4,000 years later, let's 3,500 years later, are jamming into the Bible saying, hey, Bible, you've got to answer this question for me. Evolution, true or false? Macroevolution, true or false? And by doing so, Christians and secularists are creating this this tension between faith and science, and it's not a tension that we really have to have. I didn't invite you on here to give you a mini sermon, John Mark. I'm sorry.
No, that was so good. Thank you.
But
no.
I'm really intrigued by this, and one of the reasons I'm really intrigued by it is because I know the 22-year-old versions of me, the 20-year-old versions of me. I know the 16-year-old who sits in our pews every week or our YouTube channel and asks themselves, "This sounds really good, but it's not compatible with a scientific worldview," which people I care about and trust are telling me is the way I know things. This is asking me to suspend reality as I know it and embrace something mysterious and unseen and unmeasurable. And so it becomes a major apologetic question that we have to help young people and seekers answer. And so I would like to formulate a question out of this, but I just want to say bravo to you for walking with young people through that and helping them understand an integrated universe, a compatible worldview.
Thanks. And I really appreciate what you were saying too. Like, I feel like it's really easy in some circles to settle for really easy answers, right? Like in the answers to these questions are like complex and nuanced, and like it takes a lot of work to understand them a little bit. And I feel like I've so much more to learn, but like I feel like from being in the position I'm in, I'm like forced to explore some of these things, and I'm thankful for that, because I can imagine like my son, when he's like that 16-year-old kid in the pew you're talking about, like, I mean, there are lots of things I hope I'm ready to talk to him about at that stage in his life, but like that's one thing I really hope I'm able to like, I don't know, like empathize with and articulate in a way that rings true for him.
Yeah, and it's probably going to happen, heads up, before he's 16, right? So already my little inquisitive 8-year-old, he's such a bright kid, is saying he's already realized the incompatibility of like an 8-year-old reading of Genesis 1 and 2 with dinosaur bones. He's like, how does this work, Dad? Like, and we haven't gotten into ways careful, orthodox ways you can read Genesis 1 and 2, and you can talk about dinosaur bones as more than just a way that God tested humanity. And maybe that's true. I would be a little surprised if that's the answer that we end up with when we get to heaven and we ask God our 8-year-old question, which is, help me understand the giant dinosaur monster that is in Vita de Leyva, because that thing is super cool, but I want to understand it in light of Genesis 1 and 2 and Noah's Ark. Help me to understand this. So it's going to come a lot sooner than the 16-year-old Theo.
Good to know.
So while we're on the topic of parenting, I know a lot of parents who they like inquiry, right? They like this idea of teaching someone, giving someone the tools to understand the world around them. Which, like that is useful no matter what you do, no matter where you live. That's useful. But they want to keep science as we understand it at arm's length, because they're worried that their kid who is interested in the sciences is going to go off to university and they're going to have their faith shattered into a million pieces, and it will be irreparable by the time they're finished with it. So as you think about parents that are nervous about the development of their kids and losing their faith at the expense of the scientific faith system, how are you counseling them?
Yeah. I think, I think the main thing that you can do is just encourage your kids' personal relationship with Christ, right? Like that's the most important thing. And obviously, like, in a situation of sending them off to university, you can like cover them with prayer, but also encourage them to find mentors at university, specifically mentors in the sciences who are also believers. I think a lot of times we think like, oh, like scientists aren't Christians. That's not a thing. But like, and in reality, it's like true that like there are, the percentage of like scientists and science professors who are atheists is far greater than the general population. However, they're also, it's also really easy to underestimate the fact that there are plenty of Christians who are scientists and science professors at university, and like really like intentionally seeking that out to have those conversations with people. Because I find that like, if you have a strong personal relationship with Christ, but you're struggling in these types of conversations about science and faith, like there are some people who aren't super helpful to talk to because either that's just something that it's not on their radar, like they haven't thought through it, or it just doesn't conflict with there's no conflict in their mind, right? And it's really hard to talk to people like that because it's hard to articulate what you're feeling and what you're thinking, and right. But like finding people who are dedicated believers who are also dedicated scientists and being able to have those conversations with them, I think is really important. It might not be an easy thing to find, but I think it's like worth the effort to find that mentor who can talk about things like that with.
Yeah, I just want to say for anyone who's watching, a parent or student or adult who just has, you're feeling the tension of faith and science, and you have questions. Our church is a place where we would love to have those sorts of conversations with you. I'm not a scientist. I didn't make it out of my freshman semester in the sciences. But I do understand the Bible and have done some work in understanding Genesis 1 and 2, and would love to talk to you about that. And somebody like John Mark is in our church and is willing to have these conversations with you or with your adolescents, if you are the adolescent, or as an adult. And we can put resources in your hand, or have the conversations, help you have the conversations that you want to have. And that segues to my next question, John Mark. What are there some resources that you recommend to Christians or to Christian parents along the journey of integrating faith and science?
Yeah, a couple books I'd really recommend. So I have one right here actually. As far in relation to questions about the origins of the universe and the origins of life and stuff like that, is this book. I don't know if you can see it. Called "Mapping the Origins Debate." It's written by a guy who at one point was a professor at Wheaton College, and he kind of looks at, I think it's 6 different models, both from the one side of the spectrum where it's a literal 7-day creation model to the opposite side of the spectrum, like Big Bang, an example of origin of the universe, and he kind of evaluates them all relatively objectively, I think, and kind of like explains their strengths and also like what they need to answer for in their model or whatever. I think it's a super helpful resource for me as I think about those things, and especially like I think it's especially good for someone who maybe doesn't want a simple answer. Like it's not going to tell you like what you should think, but it's like very helpful in kind of understanding the nuance of the different theories around it. The other book I don't have with me right now, but that I really appreciated in terms of kind of like what you're saying, like these tensions we feel between our faith and other forces, and how to work through those, is a book I read this summer called "Confronting Christianity" at Rebecca McLaughlin. She has a chapter in there specifically about doesn't science disprove Christianity, and she responds to that, and it's really good. But also she responds to a lot of other questions that are very in a really, really articulate and well thought out way. So I'd highly recommend that book as well.
Yeah, that's an excellent resource. It's one that I mentioned in my sermon 2 or 3 weeks ago. I don't remember which sermon it was exactly, but it's a great resource for people who are asking the questions of a 21st century skeptic, or the questions that you feel embarrassed to ask of someone who's in the church, but you hear the world around you asking, and you're like, "Oh, I have the same questions." Excellent book. She's coming out with, in about 3 months, a children's version of that book, so that parents like us can have these conversations initially with our kids, who are beginning to develop these questions and sensing these tensions and seeing people they respect and love disagree and have they're developing their own doubts. So that I'm excited about that book. I think she just finished the writing or the submission, or whatever, but it's coming soon. It looks excellent.
Cool. Awesome.
What else, John Mark? Are those the two that you had in mind?
Those are the two I had in mind. Yep.
Who's the author of the first one?
It's a guy named Gerald Rau, R-A-U. Like, so Gerald, and last name R-A-U.
Excellent. I would recommend C. John Collins' book on faith and science. It's called Faith and Science. It's massive. It's thorough. He's the guy, the MIT linguist. It's brilliant. And he's done some work. He did some work at Trinity Divinity for his sabbatical a few years ago. He's written some other books that are very good, like Did Adam and Eve Really Exist? And I find that's a fantastic book. It's really, really good. And the answer is yes, they did. But he's written on, C.S. Lewis actually did some work in this question too. Are miracles compatible with the world that we live in? How would we explain things like that? Is it okay to not be able to explain things? And if we find an explanation, does it devalue the miraculous nature of the miracle? So a lot of people have written on this, and C. John Collins and Rao and McLaughlin, these are great places to go. Tim Keller's written on some of this too in his apologetic books. John Mark, I hate to put you on the spot like this, but as you try to figure out the world we live in, are there some non-negotiables scientifically that you have? So, for example, this question of Adam and Eve. The Christian worldview hinges upon there being a literal Adam and Eve who were created special. In time and in space, right? So Adam and Eve being created by God in time and space. That's the non-negotiable that C. John Collins, Jack Collins argue for. But are there other things like that as you help people in their inquiry of the world, where you say this is one of the things we can't negotiate?
Yeah. So I don't know about as necessarily as specific as Adam and Eve, but just a little more generally, like it's non-negotiable that God created the world. It's non-negotiable that God intervenes in the natural world to this day, right? And yeah, those are the first two that come to my mind.
Those are the two I was thinking that you might say, like a creating something out of nothing, ex nihilo creation needs to be a non-negotiable. And that God is still involved. He's not the clockmaker who just wound it all up and said, "Oh, let's see what happens." That's pretty significant. Yeah. Anything else come to mind?
I'm sure there are more. I can't think of anything else at the moment. All right, what else comes to mind for you? I'm sure you.
No, I think that's those are the three, at least from the origins of the universe, and as we think about miracles. I'm not going to be especially surprised if we get to heaven and once we experience life in the new world, if we discover all of these unseen layers of observable science that explain some of the miracles we saw Jesus do. Like, it's not going to shock me to learn about other dimensions and other. I don't want to go into a whole lot of detail here, but it's not gonna shock me to pull out the DVDs. I'm sure we're using DVDs on the New Earth, but to pull out the DVDs of some of the miracles you read about in the New Testament and the Old Testament, and there's actually an explanation. Like, here's how this works. You wouldn't have had access for 10,000 years to understand this particular dimension of how the world works, but. I'm God. I created all this stuff. There's a logic to my creation, and here's what I was using. You just didn't know about it, and you wouldn't have known about it if history had continued. But
interesting.
So I could be completely wrong, and you can make fun of me in heaven if I am on that. But
we'll pull up the DVD of this YouTube video.
Well, but I think there is a larger there's something about the identity of our God that is important behind that, like my dreaming and my thinking about what we would call sci-fi realities. It's that God actually likes science. He applauds his people knowing about his world and how his world works. And if that weren't the case, you wouldn't have heard him say what you quoted him saying, like, have dominion. Here's the garden, here's my creation. Have dominion. I've given you this innate, inquisitive nature. Go and figure it out. Enjoy. Put the pieces together. Explain how it works. Just don't forget that it all starts with me. So I see God as the capital S scientist to our little s sciences that we're still figuring out, and we think we know so much, but man, we may just be barely scratching the surface.
Totally.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're going long here, and I could keep doing this, but tell us a little bit about challenges that COVID-19 has created for you as an educator, right? So, as I dream about your job, all right, everybody, and you've got your computer screen set up. Take your owl pellet, and I'll show me the owl pellet. All right, I want you to, you can't do some of the
Totally.
Experimentation that you want your learners to do. What has this presented you?
Yeah, so COVID-19, is causing science educators all over the world to have to be a lot more creative with how we incorporate that hands-on component to learning, of course. I think it is really like a challenge. It's a lot easier with virtual learning to focus on just like content, like, hey, go learn about this. Here's how you're going to learn about it. And, it not focus as much on those skills we talked about. I think right now, my biggest thing that is most challenging right now is what's most challenging for every teacher right now. And that's forming relationships with kids online, right? Like in the spring, at least in our situation, like I knew all these students. I taught them for 6 or 7 months prior to going online. So it's like, I knew them all. We had a relationship. And this year we started school on Tuesday, and I can just tell, like, I feel way more tired at the end of the day this year because I'm trying to get to know these kids and build bonds and relationships. And I really want to focus on those relationships these first couple weeks. And, but doing that is challenging and just tiring. And I hope and I think we'll be on campus at some point this year, and that'll be great. But until then, I want to focus on building these relationships as much as possible, and it's challenging.
Yeah, I hadn't even thought about that dynamic about how you knew your students last year, at least last semester, and then you switched to, but now you have to meet a classroom of people. In the same way, I'm having to meet the new people that are arriving to our church, and it's going to be very weird. But the challenge is heightened for you because you have a classroom of people and what you're doing with their education is massively important.
And I think they're always, even when you're on campus with a classroom full of kids, there are always those kids who fall through the cracks.
Right.
And distance learning just makes their plight even worse. It's so much easier to fall through the cracks on a Zoom call than it is when you're sitting in a chair in class, right? So building those relationships, but also being mindful of the kids who might not be talking as much or might be struggling is definitely a challenge I think all teachers are facing right now.
Yep. Well, how else would you want someone to pray for you before they close this video as you are on in this way?
Yeah, I think just pray for, I would really appreciate prayer. So thank you. I guess pray for stamina, right? I think we're all in the same boat with this pandemic as far as needing stamina with all the virtual interactions we're having and the challenges we have through work. But I'd really appreciate prayer for that, and just being upheld in pursuing my mission right now, like you mentioned, and even though it's tiring. And I think also kind of an added challenge that I know a lot of parents can relate with is just kind of the balance between work life and family life when you're working from home. I've never worked from home before this, and it's to be able to draw boundaries between the two, when you're in the same place doing both of them, right? Like taking care of Theo in my case, as well as teaching students. So I think just prayer and wisdom for Ella and I as we kind of navigate that in a relatively small apartment would be really appreciated. And ultimately that, I think we're all hoping to see like COVID-19 or COVID-19 in 2020 have, we all want to see those like redeeming aspects to it. I think we already are in some respects. But I just pray that, we would look back on this time, even this time with as a teacher right now working online so much, and just really see the like God's handiwork in what he's doing through these relationships, through what I'm learning through this process, kind of what our challenge is as we go through this strict quarantine coming up, like we mentioned. And yeah, so lots of things to pray about.
Yeah, great. If your level of engagement is, if it translates at all like it has here to the classroom, you're going to do well. But yeah, we need to be praying for you and for others that are in the same boat. So let me pray for you right now before we close out.
Cool. Thank you.
Lord, thank you for John Mark. Thank you for Ella. Thanks for little Theo, for their family and the mission that they are on to come from Ohio or Michigan through Delaware, all the way to Bogota, and to be here engaged with your church, with the folks at school that John Mark is serving, with folks in their community, neighbors, friends here. This is just something really beautiful. Thank you. This really doesn't make a lot of sense unless you are Lord of the universe and you are compelling people to serve you in ways that are risky and challenging. And so we thank you that they are here. Thank you for John Mark and his very, very important mission at CNG to stand at the intersection of education and faith and science and to connect dots. And Lord, what an enormous privilege you have given him. Access to the minds of young people. Would you please give him faithfulness? Would you please give him creativity? Would you please give him clarity? I pray that you would please give him stamina, especially as the mode of work changes and it's all virtual. Lord, help him to be engaging to his students. Lord, we would love, as he says, to look back on this and to see your hand clearly, to see the way that you moved hearts in the direction of repentance and faith that wouldn't have been moved in that direction otherwise. Lord, the way that learning would happen in this that wouldn't have happened otherwise. Relationships between teacher and student experiencing a depth that they wouldn't have experienced were things in person. We have no idea what you're going to do, Lord, but we're pleading for something. Of course, we're pleading for resolution, but we're pleading for you to be at work and to bring order out of what feels like much chaos. Everything in our lives is turned upside down. So please bring about beautiful, God-honoring order in all of this. I pray for John Mark, the same way I pray for myself and for many, many others who are watching this, that you give us healthy boundaries between work and family and rest, that you protect his ability to sleep and to be able to connect with his family, because it's hard when you're doing all that stuff in the same space or on the same balcony. So Lord, please bless the family, grow the family through this, and take care of their needs, whatever they are, Lord, for their good, for your glory. We pray all this in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
All right. John Mark, thank you so much for joining us. Hang on the line, and I'll chat with you as soon as I close out the program. Thanks again for coming.
Thanks.
All right, everyone. That's all the time we have today for UCB on Mission. Now, we've got some good stuff coming up for you this week, or next week, rather. Of course, worship tomorrow morning at 11 a.m., jumping into the life of Jacob, which is ever so fascinating and messy and God glorifying. So check it out there live tomorrow morning on this channel at 11 a.m. Subscribe, like, share if you think someone would be interested in that or perhaps in this interview. Next week, you're not going to want to miss UCB on Mission because we have DJ and rock and roll historian Manolo Bellon. Hey, Manolo, I see that you just popped in the chat. It's good to see you. coming on UCB on Mission. So if you want to hear about how Manolo is on mission, it'll be a fascinating, engaging conversation as this was. So don't miss that next week, next Saturday at 3 p.m. That's all the time we have. Thanks again for joining us. Don't forget to join us again next week. And remember, if you are a Christian, then you are on mission. What will that mission look like for you this week? Let's talk about it soon. Ciao.